Hey guys, tonight we begin with the dark history for sleep, a place where half of everyday life was made up on the spot, and the other half was the result of someone forgetting to undo something they did 300 years earlier. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval town crier was never intended to become a full-time profession. In theory, he was supposed to shout one message, just one, something urgent like "the mill is on fire" or "please stop throwing rotten fish at the tax collector." After that, he'd fade quietly back into the background as medieval people normally did. But medieval Europe had a fatal flaw. Almost nobody could read. A beautifully handwritten royal decree was basically decoration. The majority of the population looked at parchment the way a cow looks at a chessboard, with polite confusion. So towns improvised. They pointed at the loudest man they could find, handed him a bell, and said, "Just yell everything for us." Temporary, simple, practical. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how a one-off emergency messenger became the medieval equivalent of a government-issued megaphone. The first time the crier made an announcement, people gathered immediately. Not because they cared what he said, but because noise attracted medieval peasants the way glowing screens attract us today. Once the town realized how efficient this was, literacy programs vanished faster than a loaf of bread during famine. Suddenly, the crier was responsible for every piece of public information: new laws, market days, missing livestock, incoming merchants, suspicious weather events. Please boil your water unless you enjoy illness. He didn't just break news, he broke silence permanently. He'd march into the marketplace at sunrise, medieval rush hour, ring a bell loud enough to make infants reconsider being born, and shout, "Hear ye, hear ye," which was medieval for "Attention, citizens, I am now ruining your morning." And people accepted it. They depended on it. The town crier was their news feed. Siri, emergency alert system, and neighborhood gossip rolled into one sleep-deprived human. Even when towns considered replacing him with posted notices, peasants protested. They didn't want to walk to a board, they didn't want to squint at uncomfortable scribbles, and they certainly didn't want to try reading while holding 12 potatoes and a chicken. So the temporary messenger got a uniform, a salary, legal authority, and job security so strong it could survive plagues, famines, and incompetent kings. Some families even turned it into a dynasty. Imagine inheriting the family business of being extremely loud. In the end, the town crier stayed for centuries because medieval Europe discovered a truth still relevant today. Why read when a man with a bell can yell it at you? The medieval world had a simple solution for losing things. Attach a bell to it. Livestock wandering off? Bell. Children wandering off? Bell. Nobles wanting everyone to know they existed? Absolutely a bell. Several, actually. It all started innocently enough. Farmers put bells on cows so they wouldn't disappear into the forest and start a new life. Simple, sensible, temporary. Just a small hack to keep track of wandering beef. But medieval Europe had a dangerous habit. Once something worked once, everyone adopted it immediately and never questioned it again. So bells spread like medieval fashion viruses. Soon, goats had bells, sheep had bells, horses had bells. One chronicler even complains that he couldn't sleep because the night air did jingle most annoyingly. Congratulations, you've invented the world's first unwanted notification system. Then someone, likely a very tired parent, said the fateful words, what if we put a bell on the toddler? And just like that, medieval childcare improved by 20%. You always knew where the small human was, or at least which direction the jingling was fading toward. The problem, of course, came when the toddler realized the bell made noise and began running simply to hear it ring, forcing the parent into medieval interval training. But it didn't stop there. Oh no, nobles got involved. And nobles ruin everything by making it fashionable. They started attaching decorative bells to cloaks, boots, belts, hats, horse harnesses, and in some cases sleeves, because nothing says "I'm important" like jingling every time you move your elbow. By the late medieval period, the wealthy had turned themselves into mobile wind chimes. Walking into court sounded like someone shaking a bag of coins. Fashionable, maybe. Practical, absolutely not. Imagine trying to sneak anywhere when you jingle like an overly dramatic house cat. And then came the jesters, who took bells to their logical conclusion. If one bell is good, 2 bells are better. 27 bells are better. Every time a jester moved, entire ecosystems fled the area. Over time, bells became so normalized that people forgot they were originally a temporary tracking device.
They became tradition, part of daily life, part of fashion, part of the soundscape of medieval towns, right up there with shouting merchants, squawking geese, and one guy coughing ominously in the corner. Bells stayed because medieval people discovered a truth modern parents deeply understand. If something moves and makes noise, at least you know where it is. Bread in medieval Europe wasn't just food. It was breakfast, lunch, dinner, political propaganda, an economic indicator, and occasionally a blunt object. Bread ruled everything. So when famine hit, kings and city councils scrambled to impose temporary bread laws, quick fixes to stabilize prices, prevent riots, and make it look like the government was doing something besides hunting and arguing about taxes. These laws were supposed to be short-term emergency measures, just a few rules to get through a bad harvest, a little don't charge people 12 chickens for a loaf kind of thing. Except medieval governments had the same weakness as modern ones. Once they make a law, they never remembered to undo it. So the temporary bread laws stayed and became permanent fixtures of medieval life, whether people liked it or not. The most famous example is England's assize of bread and ale, a rule created during food shortages saying bakers could not overcharge, underweight, or otherwise scam desperate customers. Sensible, temporary, helpful. And then the government said, actually, let's keep this forever until the end of time, or until Britain invents supermarkets, whichever comes first. This single temporary law lasted over 600 years, far outliving the kings who wrote it, the bakers who hated it, and the peasants who pretended not to understand it. The law was so detailed it bordered on comedy. It regulated bread size, bread weight, bread price, what ingredients you could use, what ingredients you couldn't use, how drunk the ale merchant was allowed to be. Answer, not very. A baker could be fined, shamed, imprisoned, or thrown onto a medieval version of Yelp reviews if their loaf was even slightly too small. Forget burning down a village, that was practically negotiable, but selling a light loaf? Straight to jail. The bread police, yes, that was a real job, patrolled markets, weighing loaves like medieval personal trainers, checking for cheating. The tragedy, the famine ended, the shortages ended, but the bread laws were still there, breathing heavily over bakers' shoulders like an overprotective grandmother. Medieval people accepted it because tradition is stronger than logic, and because bread riots were terrifying. Angry mobs armed with stale loaves were not to be underestimated. So a temporary regulation intended to stop chaos became one of Europe's longest-lasting, most micromanaging laws, all because nobody wanted to say, hey, do we still need this? Straw in tavern floors began as one of those charming medieval temporary ideas that should have lasted a single evening and then politely exited history. Some innkeeper preparing for a feast or festival scattered clean straw across the floor to absorb spilled ale, mask questionable smells, and give the place a rustic, cozy atmosphere. Guests loved it, or more accurately, they were too intoxicated to complain. The innkeeper woke up the next morning, surveyed the scene of destruction, and realized something miraculous. The straw had absorbed everything. The ale, the mud, the tears, the mysterious puddles that no one could identify. It was nature's medieval cleaning product. All he had to do was rake it up and replace it. A perfect short-term solution. But medieval innkeepers, being medieval, took this as a sign from heaven. If straw made cleanup easier once, why not always? Why not keep the floors permanently covered in something visitors couldn't see through, smell through, or judge too harshly? And so a temporary decoration became a lifestyle choice. Soon, travelers expected taverns to have straw on the floor. If you entered a medieval inn and saw bare wood, something was terribly wrong. Either you had wandered into a noble establishment where they frowned upon fun, or the place had been recently robbed and the straw stolen for warmth. Straw became part of the tavern identity, as essential as the bar, the ale, and at least one man in the corner who definitely wasn't sleeping, just resting his eyes. Over time, the straw layer thickened. New straw was thrown on top of old straw. More drinks were spilled, more boots tracked in mud, more arguments ended in overturned tankards. Eventually, tavern floors developed geological layers, like an archaeological site, each stratum telling the story of last night's questionable decisions. The smell did not improve, but medieval people were trained professionals in ignoring smells. Their homes smelled like smoke, livestock, sweat, and occasionally despair. A little tavern straw odor didn't even register on their olfactory scale. Even health inspectors in later centuries complained about tavern straw harboring fleas, spilled ale, and several life choices no broom could undo. But by then, it was too late. Straw floors were tradition. You don't argue with tradition, especially not while standing in it. So what started as a one-night aesthetic choice became a continental habit that lingered for centuries, all because someone once said, just throw some straw on it. Castle kitchens, in theory, were supposed to be carefully planned. After all, the kitchen was one of the most dangerous places in any medieval stronghold. Open flames, boiling cauldrons, sharp knives, and cooks who had been awake since dawn plotting revenge against under-seasoned meat. You'd think castle architects would design these spaces with precision, but medieval reality was flexible. Many castle kitchens began not with a blueprint, but with a crisis. Maybe the original kitchen burned down because medieval kitchens excelled at that. Maybe the castle was under siege and they needed to cook somewhere, anywhere that wasn't currently on fire. Maybe the lord suddenly decided he needed a larger banquet hall for impressing guests, and the kitchen was rudely shoved aside like an unwanted stool. Whatever the reason, temporary kitchens popped up in the oddest places. A hallway? Sure. A spare chamber? Why not? A room directly next to the latrines? Absolutely disastrous, yet repeatedly chosen. The logic was always, we'll fix it later. Later never came. Once a temporary kitchen began functioning, castle life simply adapted around it. Servants memorized awkward new routes, fire wardens prayed quietly, architects pretended not to see what was happening, and cooks became experts in navigating spaces that defied every principle of human safety. In some castles, the temporary kitchen ended up nowhere near the dining hall. Servants had to carry trays of boiling stew across courtyards, down staircases, around defensive structures, and past livestock, a medieval obstacle course performed while holding soup. One misplaced step, and dinner was canceled, and someone was healing for 3 months.
Other makeshift kitchens had ceilings so low that tall cooks worked permanently hunched, giving future historians the impression that medieval cooks were a separate evolutionary branch. Some setups lacked chimneys, so smoke simply filled whatever room was sacrificed. You can imagine how fun that was during lunch rush. But the strangest ones were the kitchens wedged into gatehouses or next to the castle's main entrance. Nothing says "Welcome to my fortress" quite like being greeted by the smell of roasting meat and the loud swearing of overworked kitchen staff. Despite the chaos, people got used to it. Castle life flowed around these strange kitchen placements until they became accepted permanent features. The emergency improvisation solidified into architecture. And that truly is the medieval way. If it works today, That's good enough for the next 200 years. Medieval rulers loved making temporary laws. They issued them the way modern people send text messages, frequently, impulsively, and without thinking about consequences. A king would wake up, hear that someone's goats had escaped again, create a decree on the spot, and declare, "This shall stand only until the crisis ends." But medieval crises never really ended, so neither did the laws. Take, for example, a temporary ban on selling fish on Sundays because the bishop was annoyed by market noise during sermons. This should have lasted a week, maybe two. Somehow it became a regional law that lasted longer than the church building itself. Or imagine a rule forbidding citizens from walking around the castle after dark unless accompanied by a lantern and at least one sober adult. Introduced during a short-lived crime spike, it remained on the books for centuries. Future generations wondered whether medieval night air had once been dangerously unpredictable. The core problem was that medieval Europe lacked a delete button. Once a law was written down, it joined the ever-growing family of legal siblings crowding the margins of parchment scrolls. No one wanted to be the official who suggested abolishing an old law, because what if it was still important? What if it offended a saint? What if it unleashed chaos, or worse, bureaucracy? As time passed, these temporary laws accumulated into legal clutter. Historians digging through archives today still find bizarre rules like no pigs may enter the marketplace unless wearing a control rope, or citizens shall not throw snowballs at soldiers. The fact that someone needed these laws is both hilarious and deeply concerning. Some laws became so outdated that people forgot why they existed at all. Villagers followed them simply because it's always been done that way, even when nobody remembered what it was. And if someone dared question it, elders would respond with the medieval equivalent of, "Don't ask questions, child. Tradition is tradition." The funniest part, medieval rulers occasionally tried to clean up the system by issuing new temporary laws to fix the old temporary laws, which quickly became additional permanent laws. Legal reform was like trying to extinguish a fire by throwing parchment at it. In the end, medieval Europe didn't just inherit traditions from its ancestors, it inherited centuries of spontaneously created regulations that refused to die. A temporary decree could disappear overnight, or it could haunt society until the Renaissance. You never knew. The moat, that classic symbol of castle power and architectural drama, was not originally part of some grand master plan. Most medieval moats began as temporary ditches dug hastily during emergencies. Picture a worried noble pacing around his fortress saying, "Dig something, anything, just make it harder for enemies to walk toward us with knives." And so, peasants grabbed shovels and began creating Europe's future real estate aesthetic. These ditches were meant to slow attackers, not become permanent water hazards. Many weren't even filled with water at first. They were just glorified holes in the ground. But because medieval Europe adored turning accidents into tradition, lords began thinking, well, the ditch is already here. What if we keep it? Then someone had a truly groundbreaking idea. What if we fill it with water? This was followed by, where will we get the water? And then, I don't know, steal it from the river. Thus, moats were born, courtesy of improvisation, desperation, and mild hydrological theft. The moment a ditch got water, everything changed. Suddenly, the castle looked far more intimidating. Visitors saw it and thought, ah, yes, this lord is serious. He has a water hole. Never mind that the water was often murky, stagnant, and occasionally home to an ecosystem no biologist would dare approach. To medieval eyes, it screamed authority. Of course, water moats came with side effects. Mosquitoes rejoiced, local frogs received an unexpected housing upgrade, the castle's laundry staff discovered that retrieving laundry blown into the moat required bravery and prayer, and every so often someone tried to wade across and learned the universal truth: mud does not care about human dignity. Still, moats worked. They discouraged attackers, slowed siege engines, and prevented casual strolls toward the walls. A moat made invading a castle feel less like a confident march and more like an obstacle course designed by someone who hated you personally. So, naturally, moats stayed even after the emergency ended, even after warfare changed, even after cannons made walls questionable and moats borderline pointless. Lords kept them because they looked impressive. Some emptied the water and turned their moats into gardens, menageries, or extremely inconvenient walking paths, but they refused to fill them in. A temporary ditch dug in panic became one of the most iconic defensive features in medieval architecture, all because one noble long ago shouted, "Just dig a hole," and everyone else decided the hole was beautiful. In the medieval world, taverns were the social glue holding communities together. They were the newspaper, the therapy office, the entertainment center, and occasionally the place where you woke up wondering whose boots you were wearing. And because taverns were such essential meeting points, they invented a concept modern humans know very well, the tab. But medieval tabs were never meant to be long-term. The idea was simple. You forgot your coins or you didn't feel like stumbling home to fetch them, so you told the tavern keeper, "Put it on my account." A harmless arrangement, temporary, friendly, and intended to be settled at the end of the week. Except medieval people had the same self-control as modern people staring at a cheesecake. The tab kept growing. At first, it was a few ales, then a dinner, then another ale because someone insulted your chicken, then a round for everyone because that joke you told was definitely worth celebrating. Soon, you owed so much that paying it off required divine intervention or a highly profitable harvest season. The tavern keeper, of course, tracked all of this with alarming precision. While medieval accounting in general could be described as improvised optimism, tavern books were ironclad. He might forget who owned the sheep wandering outside, but he absolutely remembered that you owed him 11 ales, 3 meals, and 1 broken stool from last Thursday. When a customer died, which in medieval times happened with cheerful frequency, the tavern keeper simply transferred the tab to the next of kin. Medieval inheritance law was merciless. Land passed to heirs, debts passed to heirs, and yes, the tavern tab passed to heirs. Imagine inheriting your great-uncle's bar bill and thinking, "I wasn't even born when he bought this soup." Some families carried tavern debts like cursed heirlooms. A young man would declare, "I am finally free to start my life," only for the tavern keeper to appear like a medieval tax spirit and say,
Actually, you owe 6 gallons of ale your grandfather drank during the famine of 1321. Tavern tabs became so entrenched that some villages treated them like unofficial credit systems. People traded, negotiated, and even bragged about their tabs. The most impressive villages owed enough to mortgage a small castle. In the end, the medieval tab lasted because it solved a problem everyone had, wanting ale now and responsibility later. It was a temporary convenience that became a generational institution, a medieval tradition born from thirst and perfected by procrastination. In the medieval winter, survival required creativity, determination, and occasionally the willingness to let a chicken sleep in your living room. The original idea was simple and practical. During the coldest months, when temperatures could drop lower than a nobleman's empathy, peasants brought their chickens indoors temporarily to prevent them from freezing to death. After all, a living chicken produced eggs, but a frozen one produced only disappointment. This was meant to be a seasonal arrangement, 3 months of winter together, then everyone politely returning to their designated living spaces. But medieval humans quickly discovered an unexpected benefit. Chickens indoors meant eggs indoors. No more stumbling out into a snowstorm just to see if a hen felt generous. The hen was now sitting by the hearth like a grumpy feathered roommate, warming herself and silently judging everyone. Soon, chickens claimed corners of cottages, rearranged straw piles, and strutted around with the confidence of beings who knew they were essential to household survival. The peasants accepted this. They were used to sharing their homes with smoke, tools, children, and occasionally livestock, so a chicken or 3 barely registered as unusual. The problem arose when winter ended and the chickens didn't want to leave. By spring, many hands had grown accustomed to luxury living. Why go back to the drafty coop when the cottage offered warmth, companionship, and unrestricted access to fallen crumbs? It didn't take long for peasants to realize that their temporary winter guests were now permanent tenants. Cottage life reorganized itself around them. Families stepped carefully to avoid crushing a half-asleep hen. Meals involved chewing chickens away from the table with the same tired sigh used on misbehaving toddlers. Conversations were frequently interrupted by enthusiastic clucking, and every household developed that one chicken who believed she was in charge. Chickens became part of the domestic soundtrack, the crackle of the hearth, the quiet hum of conversation, and the occasional triumphant cackle announcing an egg delivery. Medieval visitors barely noticed. After all, their own cottages were equally chaotic. If anything, a chicken indoors was a sign of prosperity because it wasn't dead. Over generations, the practice became normalized. What began as a crisis measure transformed into a charmingly chaotic tradition. Cottages became micro-farms, and chickens became unofficial members of the family. In the end, medieval people didn't just adapt to chickens indoors, they embraced it. And honestly, the chickens did too. In the early medieval world, most people didn't have surnames. Villages were small, nobody moved anywhere, and everyone knew everyone else's business anyway. If you said John, everyone knew which John you meant, usually from the context of scandal. But as populations grew, medieval society encountered a troubling problem. There were too many Johns. The solution? Temporary nicknames, just a quick descriptor to tell people apart. John the baker, John the tall, John the quiet, John who smells slightly of fish. These labels were meant to be casual, flexible, expendable, used for a season, maybe a lifetime, but certainly not for all eternity. And then medieval bureaucracy entered the chat. When governments started recording taxes, property, and legal disputes, scribes needed identifiers. They couldn't write, John, the one who lives kind of near the well, but not too close because of that incident, so they used whatever nickname the community already had for him. Once written down, the name became official, and once it became official, it became hereditary. Which is why hundreds of years later, normal families walk around with names like Short, Long, Armstrong, Swift, Brown, Cook, Fisher, and Baker. Names that began as quick labels, shouted across muddy streets, and never meant to be immortal. Some medieval nicknames were flattering, most were not. Imagine being called John the Bald for one winter while your hair was growing back, only for your descendants 500 years later to sign checks as Mr. Bald. Or consider William Crookednose, whose family desperately wished medieval scribes had taken the day off when that name was recorded. Then there are surnames like Folks, Stout, Pepper, Fox, and Goodman, names that hint at personality traits, professions, local jokes, or unfortunate events no one in the modern family remembers, but definitely happened. The funniest cases are the surnames that freeze a single moment in time, like a medieval screenshot. Someone once slipped in the mud, or chased a goat, or burned a batch of bread, and now their descendants are forever known by the fallout of that moment. That's not a surname, that's cosmic comedy. By the late medieval world, surnames were locked in. Temporary nicknames had transformed into full-blown identities. The medieval world took a fleeting joke and made it genealogical destiny. And honestly, that might be the most medieval thing of all. Medieval Europe did not plan its road system. Planning implies intention, foresight, meetings, diagrams, and at least one person saying, let's not do this terribly. Medieval roads, on the other hand, happened because enough people walked through a muddy field until a trench appeared, and everyone collectively decided, ah yes, this is the road. Now, originally, these paths weren't meant to last. They were temporary shortcuts created during seasonal changes. Farmers taking a quicker route during harvest, shepherds guiding animals around flooded meadows, merchants trying to avoid whatever wolf lived near the main path. These routes were improvised, accidental, and deeply, profoundly unsuitable for long-term use. But medieval society had a rule. If something worked once, it would be used forever. Permanence by laziness. Soon, entire communities adopted these muddy trenches as their main roads. No paving, no gravel, not even an attempt to flatten the ground. Just a line of churned earth carved by human feet, horse hooves, cartwheels, and the occasional confused goose. And then it rained. Rain was the mortal enemy of medieval travel. A pleasant drizzle could transform a road into a swamp, and a proper storm could turn it into something resembling bread dough. Carts got stuck, horses sank, people lost shoes so frequently that finding footwear in the mud was basically a neighborhood hobby. Medieval chroniclers describe roads as deep, treacherous, or impossible, which are polite ways of saying, do not attempt unless you enjoy suffering. Yet no one fixed them. Why? Because maintenance required effort, and effort required organization, and organization required someone being in charge. Medieval villages were masters at avoiding all three. The crown occasionally declared, henceforth all towns shall repair their roads, and towns responded with the medieval equivalent of nodding politely and doing nothing. Eventually, these temporary mud trails became so established that maps recorded them, merchants relied on them, armies marched along them, and no one remembered they weren't supposed to be permanent. Travelers described journeys as spiritual trials, which is historian speak for, I never want to see mud again. By the time proper paving arrived centuries later, some roads had been muddy for so long that people practically considered the mud sacred. It had heritage, tradition, personality. A temporary shortcut had become a medieval highway, and every medieval traveler suffered for it. Medieval battles were chaotic, loud, dusty, and full of people wearing helmets that made it impossible to tell friend from enemy. So commanders developed a simple, temporary solution: a flag, a bright, recognizable piece of cloth held high above the carnage to say, if you're on this side, don't stab anyone standing under this banner.
That was it. The flag was never meant to be anything more than a practical battlefield marker. No symbolism, no pride, no national identity, just a medieval version of team jersey, but significantly flappier. Yet, as usual, medieval people refused to let a temporary idea remain temporary. A flag that had survived one battle, usually by pure luck, was considered heroic. Soldiers adored it. Commanders insisted on using the same one again, and soon the temporary banner turned into an emotional support cloth that people were willing to die for. And if the flag got lost in battle, that was a national tragedy. Chroniclers described it with the same sorrow they use for natural disasters. The loss of a flag was like losing a beloved relative, except the relative was made of linen and had definitely never contributed to family gatherings. Then came the upgrades. Nobles began decorating their flags with symbols, animals, mottos, and colors that were supposed to inspire the troops, though half the soldiers were illiterate and the other half colorblind due to living in the Middle Ages. Still, the banners grew more elaborate, turning into works of art too precious for the battlefield. Naturally, they kept bringing them to battles anyway. Some flags gained legendary status simply because they survived. Imagine a scrap of cloth that made it through 2 wars, 3 sieges, and 1 extremely dramatic thunderstorm. People started attributing divine protection to it. "This banner cannot fall," they cried, as if it were the medieval equivalent of plot armor. And with every battle it survived, its reputation inflated like a medieval ego. Over time, these battlefield banners outgrew their original purpose. They became symbols of kingdoms, peoples, cultures, and identities. What began as a temporary "don't stab us" indicator transformed into a defining emblem of entire nations. Centuries later, people look at national flags with reverence, imagining deep philosophical meaning behind every stripe and symbol. The truth? Most of them started because someone needed a big, visible stick to tell soldiers where not to swing their swords. A temporary battlefield hack accidentally became the logo of civilization. In medieval Europe, a feast day was originally a rare treat, an occasional celebration to honor a new saint, commemorate a miracle, or distract everyone from the fact that winter had lasted 7 months and morale was low. These feast days were supposed to be temporary, occasional little sparks of joy in a world where plumbing was a myth and bread was considered mildly exciting. But medieval people quickly discovered something important. Feast days were significantly more enjoyable than work days.
The moment a village celebrated one feast day successfully, meaning there was singing, ale, meat, and only a minimal number of fights, everyone said, "We should absolutely do this again." Other villages heard about it and said, "Why don't we have a feast day like that?" And the church, which loved a good saint, kept officially approving more. Soon, the medieval calendar resembled a child's notebook, packed, chaotic, and containing celebrations no one remembered assigning. What began as a handful of holy days ballooned into an overwhelming schedule of feasts, vigils, saints' birthdays, saints' deaths, saints' cousins, miracles, and local traditions that made perfect sense to villagers, but zero sense to historians. Some towns celebrated the feast of the saint who allegedly chased away a plague. Others honored the saint who stopped a cow from escaping. One village even held a feast for a man who did something good with bread, though the details were tragically lost to time. The result was glorious chaos. On paper, medieval peasants were supposed to work most days of the year. In reality, depending on the region, up to 1/3 of the calendar was consumed by feasts, half-feasts, pre-fasts, and post-feasts. You might wake up planning to harvest barley, only to discover it was Saint Someone or Other's Day, and thus, by the sacred laws of tradition, you were required to socialize and drink instead. Even authorities complained, but not enough to stop the trend. Kings sometimes tried to reduce the number of feast days for productivity, only to attend them enthusiastically when invited. Priests tried to enforce moderation and ended up hosting the most elaborate celebrations. Hypocrisy was part of the charm. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was drowning in feast days, and no one could remember which ones were originally temporary celebrations. A single event meant to lift village spirits had evolved into a permanent excuse to stop working, and medieval people, being geniuses in their own chaotic way, embraced it wholeheartedly. Medieval hairstyles were not designed with subtlety or restraint. They were created by people who woke up one morning, made a questionable grooming decision, and accidentally launched a regional trend. Many of the most iconic medieval hairstyles, the ones we see in manuscripts and wonder why, began as temporary experiments, jokes, or acts of desperation. Take the infamous tonsure, for example. Monks shaved the top of their heads, supposedly to symbolize humility. Realistically, it probably began because someone made a hair-cutting mistake, panicked, and declared, "It's holy now." Instead of correcting the mistake, monasteries adopted it for centuries, producing thousands of holy men who looked permanently startled. Then there were the shaved foreheads worn by fashionable noblewomen. This started as a short-lived attempt to create the illusion of a larger, more elegant forehead, considered the height of beauty. A single noble woman probably tried it as a joke or to hide a botched haircut, and suddenly half the continent was plucking and shaving their foreheads as if auditioning to be medieval light bulbs. Temporary fad? Absolutely. Did it last 100 years? Tragically, yes. Other trends spread through pure social pressure. Imagine a duke shows up to court with a ridiculous haircut, 2 tufts sticking out like horns, or hair shaped into a cone, or curls so elaborate they require architectural support. People laugh, thinking it's satire, but the duke insists it's fashion, and because he's powerful, everyone reluctantly imitates him. Within months, the entire noble class is walking around looking like they lost a bet with a sculptor. And then there were the practical disasters that became fashion statements. A knight returns from battle, helmet hair in total ruin, tufts sticking out at odd angles. Instead of admitting defeat, he announces, "This is my new style." Suddenly, the other knights admire it.
Before long, they're all styling their hair to resemble someone who fought a windmill and lost. The most fascinating part, once a hairstyle took hold, even if it began as a joke, it became tradition. Manuscript illustrations immortalized it, courtiers defended it, artists exaggerated it, and medieval society clung to it with the same stubborn determination it showed toward every other temporary idea. Thus, hairstyles that should have lasted a weekend instead lasted decades, all because medieval Europeans refused to admit something looked ridiculous. In a world without mirrors, bad hair days became culture. In the Middle Ages, cities didn't grow because of thoughtful planning. They grew because people showed up, built something temporary, and then never left. What began as a collection of seasonal huts, quick shelters thrown together by traveling workers, merchants, or farmers, slowly mutated into entire neighborhoods, usually without anyone explicitly deciding it should happen. It always started the same way. A group of workers arrived to repair a castle wall, harvest a big field, or construct a church that would take approximately 14 lifetimes to complete. They needed somewhere to sleep, so they built small, simple structures, wooden huts, lean-tos, tents, anything that vaguely resembled shelter and didn't collapse immediately in the wind. These were supposed to be temporary. Use it for a few weeks, then dismantle it and go home. Except no one dismantled anything. Maybe the job took longer, maybe the workers were lazy, maybe the weather got bad and the hut felt surprisingly cozy. Regardless of the reason, medieval workers did what medieval workers always did. They shrugged and stayed. Meanwhile, more people arrived. Merchants showed up to sell bread and ale to the workers. Their stalls needed shelter too, so they added more huts. Laborers brought families who built slightly sturdier huts. Then came the blacksmith, who followed workers anywhere, like a medieval food truck. Before long, the temporary camp looked suspiciously like a village. At this point, the local lord would wander by, notice a cluster of buildings he definitely didn't authorize, and announce, "Excellent, a new district. I shall be raising rent." And with that declaration, the once temporary structures gained instant legitimacy. Over time, these accidental neighborhoods expanded. Wooden huts turned into timber-framed homes, dirt paths became muddy roads, a well was dug, a tavern appeared, because medieval people never built anything without immediately adding a tavern. By the time anyone realized a permanent settlement had formed, families had already lived there for generations. Some of Europe's most famous medieval districts began exactly this way. Unauthorized pop-up suburbs created by tired workers who did not feel like traveling back home. Urban planners today look at medieval cities and ask, why does this street twist like a panicked snake? The answer is simple. It was never meant to be a street. It was the path between two temporary huts that overstayed their welcome by about 800 years. In medieval life, temporary shelters didn't disappear, they evolved, and sometimes they accidentally became cities. Mary Tudor entered the world on a cold February morning in 1516, the long-awaited child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. She wasn't the son her father had prayed for, but she was healthy, bright-eyed, and startlingly intelligent for an infant who was barely expected to survive her first winter. Almost immediately, ambassadors wrote about her with the kind of astonishment usually reserved for prodigies. She learned Latin before most noble children learned table manners, played the virginals with practiced elegance, and carried herself with a calm dignity that made even adults straighten their posture around her. For a brief moment, she lived the life of a cherished princess in a court that adored the idea of a Tudor heir, even if she wasn't male, but because she was Henry VIII's daughter. Her early years were built on foundations destined to crack. Mary worshipped her mother, a woman of deep faith and steady resolve, who raised her with a sense of duty and piety that Mary would carry all her life. She also adored her father, who at first openly doted on her, proudly showing her off to visiting dignitaries as if she were living proof of divine approval. Little Mary had no idea that the same man who lifted her into the air, smiling, would one day strip her of her title and force her to swear her mother's marriage invalid. As Mary grew, so did Henry's anxiety about securing a male heir. Catherine's pregnancies ended in heartbreak after heartbreak, and Henry, never a man to accept misfortune without assigning blame, began to look for theological loopholes and political escape routes. The shadows lengthened around Mary's childhood as her father's attention drifted to Anne Boleyn, and the court grew tense with rumors of an annulment. Mary was old enough to understand when her world collapsed. She watched her mother exiled from court, barred from seeing her own daughter. She watched Anne rise in her place, and she learned painfully early that love at the Tudor court was conditional, especially the love of a king. By the time Mary reached adolescence, the once celebrated princess had become a political inconvenience, a child caught between her devotion to her mother and the wrath of her father. And although she survived it, the wound never truly healed. It shaped her faith, her fears, and the kind of queen she would one day become. Mary Tudor's fall from royal grace was not a single moment. It was a slow, bruising descent that stretched over years, each step more humiliating than the last. When Henry VIII broke from Rome to marry Anne Boleyn, Mary became collateral damage in a political transformation she had no power to resist. One proclamation declared her no longer the Lady Princess, but simply Lady Mary, a title carefully chosen to remind everyone that the king now considered her illegitimate. It was the kind of blow designed not only to alter her status, but to pierce her identity. The court, which once bowed to her, now treated her with a stiff politeness meant for someone who mattered only in theory. Worst of all, she was forbidden to see her mother, Catherine of Aragon, the only anchor in her storm of uncertainty. Henry and Anne understood perfectly that separating mother and daughter was a punishment far more effective than any tower cell. Letters between Mary and Catherine were smuggled like contraband, each line a mixture of devotion, despair, and stubborn courage. When Catherine insisted Mary hold firm in recognizing her as the rightful queen, Mary obeyed, even though doing so placed her in direct rebellion against her father and stepmother. And for her part, Anne saw Mary as a threat, a symbol of a rival marriage that refused to vanish. Mary's presence reminded the court that not everyone accepted Elizabeth, Anne's newborn daughter, as the true heir. Some contemporaries even reported Anne wishing Mary dead, though whether this was literal hatred or court gossip embroidered for drama remains debated. What's certain is that Mary feared Anne deeply. The two women circled each other in a political Cold War that neither could escape. Then the blow Mary had dreaded came in 1536, her mother's death. Catherine died isolated, weakened, and unwavering in her faith. For Mary, the grief was mixed with guilt. Guilt for not being able to reach her, to comfort her, to receive one last blessing.
Mary's world shrank again, leaving her alone without the one person who loved her without condition. By the time Anne Boleyn fell later that same year, executed after her spectacular collapse, Mary felt little triumph. Court factions begged her to reconcile with her father, to sign a document acknowledging herself as a bastard and her parents' marriage invalid. It was a moment of cruel irony, redemption through self-abasement. Mary signed, not because she believed it, never that, but because survival sometimes demanded surrender, and Mary Tudor, already tempered by loss, chose to live. With Anne gone and Jane Seymour rising in her place, Mary Tudor finally saw a crack of light in the walls that had closed around her for years. Jane, unlike Anne, had genuine sympathy for Mary's suffering and worked carefully, sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly, to restore peace between father and daughter. It took diplomacy, persuasion, and the relentless nudging of Charles V's ambassadors, but eventually Henry VIII relented. He allowed Mary to return to court, though on his terms, under his conditions, and only after she had signed the humiliating submission, declaring her parents' marriage unlawful. But Mary, desperate for survival and exhausted by grief, took the deal. Her return to court was bittersweet. Henry greeted her with warmth, even affection, as if the years of estrangement had been nothing more than a family spat. That was Henry's style. He expected others to forget instantly and completely the pain he inflicted. Mary was expected to smile, to obey, to slip back into the role of the beautiful Tudor daughter. She did all of that, yet inside she carried the scars of abandonment, humiliation, and a spiritual conviction that she had betrayed her mother's memory. She tried, however, to move forward. Jane Seymour helped her feel welcome. Mary adored Jane more than any of her father's wives because Jane treated her not as a symbol or a problem to be solved, but as a young woman who had survived far too much. For a moment, Mary experienced something resembling family life. She also doted on the child Jane gave birth to, the future Edward VI. Holding her baby brother, Mary allowed herself to imagine that their repaired family might endure. But stability at the Tudor court was an illusion that never lasted. Jane Seymour died days after childbirth, leaving Mary bereft once again. Her father remarried 3 more times, and each new queen represented a new political climate Mary had to navigate. Anne of Cleves was harmless. Catherine Howard, dangerously chaotic. Catherine Parr, intelligent and kind, but deeply entangled in Protestant reform, something Mary viewed with horror. Though restored, Mary walked on eggshells. Her Catholic faith was non-negotiable, and Henry's shifting religious policies constantly threatened her position. She obeyed outwardly, but never softened her beliefs. She was tolerated, not trusted, welcomed, yet watched. In truth, Mary never again felt truly safe. Her father's approval could turn to wrath in an instant, and as she approached adulthood, one thing became unmistakably clear. Her future would depend on her ability to survive the political storms still gathering over England. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Mary Tudor was 31 years old, an age, by Tudor standards, dangerously close to permanent spinsterhood. She had lived through her father's 6 marriages, religious upheaval, humiliating reversals of status, and enough emotional trauma to crush a lesser person. Now, the crown passed to her 9-year-old half-brother, Edward VI, whose radical Protestant advisors viewed Mary's unwavering Catholicism as both a political threat and a personal affront. Mary found herself suddenly vulnerable again. Despite being the king's sister and Henry's eldest surviving child, she was powerless under Edward's regency. Her properties were monitored, her mass services prohibited, and her household infiltrated with spies. Edward's council pressured her relentlessly to abandon Catholic worship, something she refused again and again, even when it placed her on the edge of treason. This resistance was not stubbornness for its own sake. Mary saw faith as her anchor, the one part of her identity no political pressure could take from her. The more they tried to bend her, the more she stiffened. Her relationship with Edward deteriorated rapidly. He saw her defiance as rebellion. She saw his demands as persecution. Their final meetings were bitter, painful exchanges between a dying boy king and a sister who understood that the moment he passed, the realm would be thrown into chaos. Edward's death in 1553 triggered exactly that. The Duke of Northumberland attempted a desperate political coup by placing Lady Jane Grey, Edward's Protestant cousin, on the throne. It was a risky move, one that banked on Mary being too isolated, too unpopular, or too frightened to challenge it. But Mary Tudor had survived far worse than political scheming. She fled, gathered supporters, and within days amassed an army greater than Northumberland's forces. Even Protestants joined her cause, not out of devotion to Catholicism, but because Mary was Henry VIII's rightful heir. She represented legitimacy in a kingdom exhausted by instability.
Mary's march to London became a swelling movement, a declaration that the true Tudor line would not be displaced. When Jane Grey's short-lived reign collapsed after just 9 days, Mary entered the capital as both a victorious claimant and a woman burdened by a lifetime of betrayals. Yet amid the triumph, she felt the weight of ruling alone. She had no husband, no children, and no guarantees that her fragile claim would survive the shifting tides of politics. Becoming queen was not the culmination of her story, it was the beginning of her most difficult chapter. Mary Tudor's accession in 1553 was nothing short of miraculous, an unexpected triumph in a world that had repeatedly tried to sideline her. Crowds flooded the streets to welcome her, bells rang, bonfires blazed across the city, and for a brief moment England seemed genuinely united behind her new queen. After decades of humiliation and political marginalization, Mary finally stood where she had always believed God intended her to be. But a crown, she quickly discovered, did not erase old wounds, nor guarantee loyalty. Her first challenge was exactly what she expected: religion. Mary was determined to restore Catholicism, not as a gentle suggestion, but as her life's mission. She believed God had preserved her specifically for this task. Her childhood trauma, her mother's suffering, her own disgrace, they all formed a narrative of divine purpose in her mind. And while this conviction made her strong, it also made her inflexible. Mary understood reform not as a political debate, but as a moral emergency. The kingdom must return to Rome, and she would be the instrument of that correction. However, even before she could address religious policy, she faced an equally urgent, deeply personal issue: the succession. She was 37, childless, and unmarried. Every advisor, ambassador, and court insider knew that without an heir, Mary's Catholic restoration would die with her. That reality terrified her council. If she failed to produce a child, her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth would inherit, and the entire religious direction of the realm would reverse overnight. To Mary, the solution was obvious. She needed to marry quickly and strategically. But who she should marry was a matter that split the kingdom in two. Some urged an English nobleman, someone who could calm fears of foreign dominance. But Mary, shaped by her mother's Spanish lineage and her own devout Catholicism, looked toward a powerful Catholic match, one that could strengthen her reform and secure her realm.
Enter Philip of Spain, son of Emperor Charles V, a man whose dynastic pedigree could bolster Mary's legitimacy and perhaps secure that longed-for child. To Mary, Philip represented stability, faith, and the hope of finally building the family life she had been denied for decades. But to her subjects, he represented something far more menacing: foreign rule, Spanish influence, and the possibility that England would become a satellite of the Habsburg Empire. Mary was crowned queen, yes, but as she prepared to marry, she would learn just how quickly public celebration could turn into suspicion, resentment, and rebellion. Mary Tudor believed her marriage to Philip of Spain would heal England's fractures, secure the Catholic faith, and finally give her the child she longed for. In her mind, this union wasn't merely political, it was providential. She saw Philip as a partner chosen not just by diplomacy, but by God himself. Yet the moment news of the proposed marriage reached the English public, the atmosphere changed. Excitement over Mary's coronation evaporated almost overnight, replaced by deep suspicion, and in some corners, outright panic. England had a long memory, and it remembered what happened when foreign powers entangled themselves with English crowns. Philip wasn't just any foreign prince. He was a Habsburg, heir to the vast Spanish Empire, and part of a dynasty known for dominating Europe. Ordinary Englishmen imagined themselves soon governed by Spanish officials, taxed to fund Spanish wars, and dragged into conflicts that had nothing to do with their island.
Even nobles who supported Mary's reign balked at the idea of Philip gaining any real influence. They feared England becoming a mere appendage of Spain, and their fears weren't entirely irrational. Mary, however, refused to bend. She trusted Philip, trusted Spain, and believed that a strong Catholic husband was essential for a strong Catholic throne. The more resistance she faced, the more stubbornly she clung to the plan. She wasn't simply marrying for love or companionship, though both mattered to her more than she admitted. She was marrying to secure the Tudor line and her mother's legacy. But the country saw it differently. In early 1554, the simmering discontent exploded into open revolt, Wyatt's Rebellion. Led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, it was a desperate attempt to stop the Spanish marriage and, depending on the faction, replace Mary with her Protestant half-sister, Elizabeth. Though the rebellion ultimately failed, it shook Mary to her core. She had expected political opposition, not armed men marching toward London with the intent to control or depose her. Mary responded with a firmness that would later help build her notorious reputation. She delivered a bold speech at Guildhall, declaring she would die a queen rather than abandon her rightful authority. It was one of the most powerful moments in Tudor history, displaying a courage even her enemies respected. But the rebellion left scars. Trust evaporated, Elizabeth fell under suspicion, and Mary learned a painful truth. Her subjects did not share her vision of salvation through marriage. Still, she proceeded. In July 1554, Philip arrived in England, and Mary walked toward a future she believed would secure her throne, unaware that it would instead deepen her sorrow. When Philip of Spain finally arrived in England in July 1554, Mary Tudor was overwhelmed with anticipation. She had imagined a partnership built on shared faith, mutual respect, and perhaps, if God willed it, affection strong enough to bless them with an heir. After years of loneliness, political isolation, and emotional deprivation, Mary longed for companionship as much as she needed a successor. She approached the marriage with sincerity and hope, believing Philip would be both a loving husband and a powerful ally. But Philip saw this union very differently. At 27, Philip was 11 years younger than Mary. He had been married before, widowed, and raised in the intensely political environment of the Habsburg court. To him, marriage was a dynastic duty, not a source of romance. The wedding was something he endured, not embraced. Contemporary accounts suggest he was courteous and respectful, but never emotionally invested. His letters to his father, Emperor Charles V, made it clear he viewed the marriage as a strategic obligation rather than a personal joy. Mary, however, misread his politeness as warmth. She was enchanted by him, his regal bearing, his piety, his continental sophistication. She fell genuinely, perhaps desperately, in love. For a woman who had spent her life deprived of affection, Philip's presence must have felt like a long-awaited affirmation of her worth. For Philip, however, England felt cold, provincial, and foreign. He disliked the climate, the politics, and the suspicion that followed him everywhere. He couldn't speak English, and he found the English nobility prickly and hostile. Worst of all, he understood that Parliament had deliberately limited his authority to prevent him from wielding real power. Mary gave her her heart. Philip gave England a polite, distant nod. Even so, he performed his duties. Publicly, he stood beside her as king consort. Privately, he remained restrained, cautious, and detached. Mary's affection grew stronger the more he withdrew, creating an emotional imbalance that would haunt their marriage. Yet, in late 1554, something remarkable happened. Mary's menstruation stopped. She felt swelling, nausea, and movement within her belly. Physicians confirmed what she longed to hear. She was pregnant, or so everyone believed. For Mary, it was the culmination of every prayer she had ever whispered. For Philip, it meant potential success for a marriage he barely tolerated. For England, it sparked hope and dread. None of them knew the truth. This pregnancy would become one of the most tragic illusions in Tudor history. By the winter of 1554 to 1555, Mary Tudor was certain she was pregnant. Her stomach swelled, her breasts grew tender. She felt the familiar signs every midwife recognized. Courtiers celebrated it, and Europe prepared for the birth of a Catholic heir who would secure England firmly within the Habsburg sphere. For Mary, the news felt like divine vindication. After a lifetime of loss, her mother, her title, her dignity, God was rewarding her with the child she had begged for since girlhood, the child that would anchor her marriage, her reign, and her faith. Her joy was real, her symptoms were real, but the pregnancy was not. Today, historians believe she suffered from pseudocyesis, or phantom pregnancy, a psychological and hormonal condition often triggered by extreme stress, trauma, and intense desire for motherhood. And Mary had all three in abundance. Her body mimicked pregnancy so convincingly that even trained physicians were fooled. She had every sign except the only one that mattered, a developing child. Nonetheless, preparations began.
A nursery was furnished. A cradle was carved. Letters announcing the birth were drafted in advance. Parliament even debated whether Philip should rule as regent if Mary died in childbirth. Philip himself softened toward Mary during this period, not because he loved her romantically, but because a successful pregnancy meant political victory. To his credit, he remained by her side far more gently than earlier accounts suggest. By spring of 1555, Mary retreated into confinement, the traditional seclusion for a queen nearing labor. The court waited. Europe waited. Mary waited day after day for pains that never came. Summer arrived, yet still no birth. Rumors began to swirl. Had the queen lied? Was this a divine punishment? A monstrous deformity? A secret miscarriage? Mary refused to leave confinement, clinging to hope, even as the truth became impossible to ignore. Finally, after months of painful anticipation, the awful realization settled in. There was no child. The swelling receded. Physicians muttered excuses. Courtiers avoided her eyes. And Mary, who had been denied love, denied stability, denied so many simple human joys, was now denied the one thing she believed God had promised her. The emotional devastation was immense. She felt humiliated, betrayed by her own body, and terrified of what her childlessness meant for England. Philip drifted away again, summoned back to continental politics. The marriage, already fragile, began to crumble, and as Mary's health declined, another cruel twist awaited her. In 1557, she once again became certain she was pregnant. It was another illusion, another heartbreak, and by then, time was running out. By 1557, Mary Tudor was once again convinced she was pregnant. Despite the failure of her first phantom pregnancy and the skepticism of even her closest ladies, the symptoms felt familiar, the hope irresistible. But this time the atmosphere was different. She was older, physically weakened, and emotionally exhausted. Philip had long since departed for Spain, returning only briefly and reluctantly to England. His distance weighed heavily on her. She mistook political necessity for personal rejection. Every letter he delayed, every absence, every diplomatic excuse deepened the loneliness that had defined her adulthood. Meanwhile, England suffered under the burden of her decisions. The persecution of Protestants, what later generations would label the Marian burnings, became the darkest stain on her reign. Mary believed she was saving souls. She saw religious uniformity as a sacred duty, a way to restore the spiritual order she believed her father had shattered. But her subjects saw something very different. Flames, fear,
and the return of a Catholicism enforced with terrifying zeal. In Mary's mind, faith demanded action. In her people's eyes, she became a tyrant. Her second phantom pregnancy followed the same tragic pattern as the first. Symptoms appeared, hopes rose, and court preparations began, only for it to become painfully clear once more that there was no child. This time, however, the consequences were far more severe. The pregnancy masked the onset of serious illness, possibly ovarian cysts or uterine cancer, though historians debate the exact cause. Whatever it was, it drained her strength rapidly. Mary's final years were marked by political isolation, personal grief, and declining health. England lost Calais, the last English possession in France under her rule, a military defeat that struck her harder than almost anything else in her life. "When I die," she reportedly said, "you will find Calais engraved upon my heart." Whether she truly uttered those words, no one can say, but the sentiment captures the despair of a queen who watched everything she cared about slip through her fingers. By late 1558, Mary was bedridden, fevered, and aware that she was dying. She named Elizabeth as her successor, a painful choice knowing her Protestant sister would undo everything she had worked for. Mary died on November 17th at just 42 years old, lonely, childless, and mourned far less than she had once imagined. History remembered her as Bloody Mary, a title that obscures the frightened, devout, wounded woman beneath the crown, a queen shaped by trauma, driven by faith, and forever haunted by the love and motherhood she never received. By 324 BCE, Alexander the Great stood at the height of his power, ruler of an empire so enormous that even his own generals struggled to comprehend it. He had marched from Macedon to the edges of India, toppling kings, storming citadels, and smashing armies that the Greeks once believed were unbeatable. His victories were legendary, his charisma unmatched, and his ambition seemingly limitless. Yet for all the land he controlled, Alexander knew his empire was far from stable. It was stitched together by force, not trust, and without unity, the seams would eventually tear. The real challenge facing Alexander wasn't geography or logistics, it was people. Macedonians and Greeks saw themselves as the rightful conquerors, viewing Persians and other Eastern peoples as subjects, not equals. Persians, meanwhile, resented the heavy Macedonian presence, the new ruler's arrogance, and the cultural disruptions that followed Alexander's campaigns. Even within Alexander's own army, tension simmered. Many Macedonian veterans disliked the increasing influence of Persian customs at court, and were uneasy with his king's insistence on wearing Persian dress. They grumbled that he was abandoning the identity of his forefathers in favor of the luxuries of the East. Alexander, however, saw a future far bigger than Macedonian pride. He envisioned an empire in which East and West were fused, a world where cultures blended, loyalties mixed, and old hostilities dissolved into a shared identity. It was an idealistic vision, but not an impossible one, at least in Alexander's eyes. He believed unity could be engineered, not merely hoped for. And if the old political tools of coercion and tradition weren't enough, then he would invent new ones. This desire for integration wasn't just philosophical. Alexander was a practical strategist with a keen sense of symbolism. He knew that gestures mattered, especially in a world where kingship was as much performance as power. To truly unite Persians with Macedonians, he needed something dramatic, something that would visually and emotionally signal a new chapter. That idea took shape during his return to Persia, when he arrived in the wealthy, cosmopolitan city of Susa. Here, he decided to stage an unprecedented spectacle, a grand imperial mass wedding that would bind his Macedonian officers to Persian nobility. Not just one marriage, but dozens, a fusion of court, culture, and dynasty in one theatrical, unforgettable moment. It would become known as the Wedding of Susa, a political masterstroke draped in gold, incense, music, and the illusion of harmony. But beneath the splendor, the fractures of empire still waited, ready to reopen. Susa was no ordinary city, and Alexander chose it deliberately.
Once a glittering capital of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, Susa had long been a crossroads of cultures, Elamite, Persian, Babylonian, each leaving layers of architecture, ceremony, and luxury behind. By the time Alexander arrived, the city was a treasure house of imperial memory. Marble halls, golden-laid floors, lush gardens, and storerooms overflowing with wealth formed a setting that practically begged for grand gestures. If Alexander wanted to show the world that Persia and Macedon were now one, Susa was the perfect stage. The city also embodied exactly what Alexander wanted his empire to become: multicultural, prosperous, and symbolically shared between Greeks and Persians. Here, Persian aristocrats still held influence, and their loyalty was essential. Winning their cooperation was not a matter of military force, but of cultural respect and political finesse. Susa's palaces still whispered the authority of Darius and Xerxes, kings who had once terrorized Greece. By holding his mass wedding here, Alexander wasn't just borrowing Persian grandeur, he was claiming it, absorbing it into his vision of a unified empire. Preparations for the event began months in advance. Caravans brought in silks, embroidered garments, perfumes, spices, and precious metals from across the empire's vast expanse. Skilled craftsmen were summoned to build platforms, decorate banquet halls, and coordinate an event as elaborate as any coronation. For the Persians, the ceremony signaled a possible restoration of pride. For the Macedonians, it felt both thrilling and unsettling. They had spent years fighting Persian armies. Suddenly, they were expected to marry into those very families. Yet Alexander's charisma and his iron will pushed the project forward. He intended the ceremony to be more than festive pageantry. It was propaganda, diplomacy, and cultural engineering rolled into one. By merging his officers with Persian noble women, he hoped to tie their future interests to the stability of the eastern provinces. These marriages were meant to create a new elite class loyal to him above all else. But beneath the golden silk, there was tension. Many Macedonians grumbled that they were being used as political pawns. Others feared that Alexander's admiration for Persian customs meant he had abandoned Macedonian values. Meanwhile, Persian nobles wondered whether these marriages truly offered unity or simply masked foreign domination with ceremonial sugarcoating. Susa shimmered, dazzling and bright. But just beneath its marble surface, the competing ambitions of East and West hummed like a storm waiting to break. The heart of the Susa spectacle lay not in the gold, the music, or the lavish halls, but in the people chosen to participate. Alexander personally selected the brides and grooms, ensuring that each match served a political purpose. His army's most elite officers, companions who had fought beside him through deserts, mountains, and endless campaigns, were paired with Persian noble women, many of them daughters or relatives of the very dynasty Alexander had conquered. It was a symbolic act, almost theatrical in its intention. The old Persia and the new Macedon bound together not by treaties or threats, but by blood. At the center of it all were Alexander's own marriages. He already had one Persian wife, Roxana of Bactria, whom he had married years earlier. But now, in Susa, he took two additional brides, Statera II, daughter of Darius III, and Parasartis, daughter of the earlier king Artaxerxes III. These unions were carefully chosen. By marrying into both the recently fallen Achaemenid dynasty and an earlier branch of Persian royalty, Alexander wrapped himself in the legitimacy of Persia's ancient kings.
He wasn't just a conqueror anymore. He was positioning himself as a rightful heir. For the Macedonians, the situation was more complicated. Some welcomed the marriages. A noble Persian bride brought prestige, political alliances, and generous dowries. Others, however, saw the arrangement as a burden. They were soldiers, not diplomats. Many already had wives back in Macedon, and while Alexander insisted this ceremony superseded any previous unions, the men knew resentment awaited them at home. The Persian brides, meanwhile, were caught between duty and uncertainty. Raised in families whose world had been overturned by Alexander's conquest, they now found themselves woven into the fabric of his empire. For some, the marriage offered security. For others, it felt like imprisonment wrapped in silk. Yet they understood the stakes. Their presence at the ceremony represented Persia's future, offered up as a gesture of trust or submission. All told, around 80 Macedonian officers were paired with noble Persian women. The scale was breathtaking. No Greek or Macedonian king had ever attempted anything like this. It wasn't merely a political strategy, it was social engineering on an imperial level. And still, beneath the ceremony's grandeur, tension simmered. Macedonians whispered about losing their identity. Persians whispered about being absorbed by force. Each bride and groom represented more than a marriage. They represented the fragile possibility of unity or the seeds of resentment that could fracture the empire from within. When the wedding of Susa finally began, it unfolded with a level of splendor that stunned even those accustomed to Persian luxury. Alexander intended the event to overwhelm the senses. Every sight, sound, and scent engineered to convey the majesty of his empire. The palace complex was transformed into a shimmering festival ground. Tapestries hung from pillars of glazed brick. Braziers released waves of fragrant incense, and gold ornaments glimmered in the torchlight like captured sunlight. Susa had seen royal ceremonies for centuries, but nothing quite like this. The banquet hall alone was legendary. Gigantic carpets woven in brilliant reds and blues rolled across the floors. Rows of gold and silver couches awaited the guests. Musicians played a blend of Greek melodies and Persian court music, creating a soundtrack that mirrored Alexander's vision, a cultural fusion, elegant and deliberate. Aromatic perfumes drifted through the air, mingling with the smell of roasted meats and sweet pastries dipped in honey. The atmosphere was intoxicating, the sensory cloud meant to dissolve all thoughts of division. The guests, Persian nobles, Macedonian officers, and representatives from across the empire, sat in a carefully arranged order. Nothing was accidental. Greek and Persian elites were placed side by side, encouraged to converse, dine, and drink together, as if the ceremony were not simply a wedding, but the inauguration of a new social order. Even the cups were symbolic. Each guest drank from vessels of identical shape and metal, a subtle reminder that status in Alexander's empire would not depend solely on ancestry. Then came the procession of brides. They entered in radiant garments, Persian dresses embroidered with gold thread, shimmering veils, and ornaments that had once belonged to the Achaemenid court. Alexander's two brides, Statera and Parasartis, walked with serene dignity, followed by the 80 Persian noble women who would marry his officers. The spectacle was emotional, political, and theatrical all at once. Macedonian soldiers watched with both awe and unease, while Persian nobles observed with quiet calculation.
When Alexander rose to speak, the hall fell silent. He addressed the crowd not as a Macedonian king, but as the sovereign of a united world, praising harmony between cultures and calling this mass wedding the dawn of a new era. His words were bold, idealistic, perhaps even naive. But in that moment, under the glow of torches and gold, it was easy to believe unity was possible.
The feast lasted for days. Wine flowed endlessly, dancers performed, poets recited verses, and gifts were showered upon the newlyweds. It was a celebration meant to erase old boundaries, but once the music faded, the true test of Alexander's grand experiment had only begun. For all its music, gold, and spectacle, the wedding of Susa was never truly about love. It was about control. Carefully engineered, brilliantly staged control. Alexander understood better than any king before him that marriage could be a political weapon far more effective than swords. By binding Macedonian officers to Persian noblewomen, he hoped to create a new ruling class whose loyalties transcended ethnicity. If these unions produced children, even better. Their mixed heritage would symbolize the future of the empire Alexander imagined, neither wholly Greek nor wholly Persian, but something hybrid, unified, and loyal only to him. From a propaganda standpoint, the strategy was dazzling. Alexander presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate Persian king, marrying daughters of the very rulers he defeated. Through these ceremonies, he claimed continuity with the Achaemenid dynasty, asserting that the empire he now commanded was not broken, but reborn under his leadership. To Persian nobles, this was both flattering and disarming. To Macedonians, it was confusing, even alarming. Their king was adopting Persian customs, Persian clothes, Persian ceremonies. Was this cultural integration or cultural surrender? The mass weddings also had a disciplinary purpose. Alexander's army, weary after years of campaigning, had grown increasingly unruly. Many veterans felt overlooked and under-rewarded, especially as Persians began occupying higher positions in administration. Alexander's solution was to tether his officers emotionally and financially to the east. A man with a Persian wife, a Persian family, and Persian estates would be far less likely to rebel, return to Macedon, or challenge Alexander's reforms. He would have something to lose. Yet beneath Alexander's grand vision, resentment simmered. Many Macedonian officers felt coerced into the marriages. Some had wives waiting for them back home. Others viewed Persian customs with disdain, and some simply didn't want to be pawns in what they saw as Alexander's increasingly unpredictable ambitions. They were soldiers forged in the rugged hills of Macedon, not diplomats ecstatic about marriage alliances. Persian families, too, had mixed reactions. While many nobles recognized the prestige of marrying into Alexander's inner circle, others saw the forced unions as a humiliating reminder of their empire's defeat. For them, the marriages symbolized submission dressed up as reconciliation. Alexander, however, believed absolutely in his experiment. He believed unity could be crafted, engineered, even enforced through ceremony. The wedding of Susa, in his mind, was a masterpiece of imperial strategy. But dreams of unity often crumble when confronted with reality, and the fractures soon began to show. The wedding of Susa was meant to be the crown jewel of Alexander's policy of fusion, his attempt to blend Macedonian and Persian worlds into a single harmonious empire. But as the celebrations faded and the guests returned to their daily lives, the cracks beneath the glitter became impossible to ignore. What Alexander envisioned as a bold step toward unity, many saw as an illusion propped up by ceremony and enforced loyalty. Alexander believed deeply in his mission. He had spent years adopting Persian court customs, surrounding himself with Persian administrators, and promoting Eastern soldiers within his ranks. To him, the empire was not meant to be a Macedonian occupation. It was meant to be a new civilization created through the merging of cultures. His marriages and those of his officers were supposed to be the emotional and biological foundation of that future. He imagined a society where identity no longer hinged on birthplace, but on allegiance to him. But this idealism collided with centuries of prejudice. Macedonians had been raised to view Persians as the monarch, luxurious, soft, decadent, and defeated.
Persians, in turn, viewed Macedonians as rough, uncultured mountain men. A single wedding, no matter how extravagant, could not erase generations of hostility. The unity Alexander tried to forge felt to many like a king forcing two unwilling worlds to clasp hands. In the months after the ceremony, the mood among Alexander's troops shifted from bewilderment to resentment. Many believed their king loved Persia more than Macedon. They whispered that he had abandoned his roots, that he was becoming another Xerxes rather than another Achilles. Some veterans felt outright betrayed, forced into marriages they didn't want, expected to adopt customs they didn't understand, and sidelined in favor of Persian elites. Persian reactions were equally complicated. While many nobles recognized the prestige of marrying into Alexander's inner circle, others recognized the imbalance of power. These marriages might symbolize unity, but Macedonians still held the army, the administration, and the crown. To them, it felt less like harmony and more like assimilation. Even Alexander's closest companions questioned his obsession with fusion. They admired his brilliance, but feared his growing detachment from Macedonian sensibilities. In their eyes, he was no longer the king who led them from the front, but a distant ruler dreaming of an empire no one else truly understood. Alexander pressed on, convinced that unity was within reach, but the reality was unavoidable. Harmony could not be commanded, and loyalty could not be manufactured through marriage. The empire looked united at Susa, but beneath the surface, it remained deeply divided. When the music of Susa faded and the last gold cups were collected, the true consequences of Alexander's grand experiment began to surface. What had been in Alexander's eyes a beautiful symbol of unity was to many of his soldiers a bitter reminder that the world they knew was slipping away.
Macedonian officers who had fought beside him since the early campaigns in Greece now felt increasingly alienated from the king they once adored. The mass marriages had not bridged cultures, they had exposed the widening fracture between Alexander and his men. For the rank and file, resentment brewed quickly. These were hardened veterans, men forged in relentless campaigns from Granicus to Gaugamela. They had endured hunger, heat, wounds, and endless marches driven by loyalty to Alexander and pride in their Macedonian identity. But now they watched their king dress like a Persian, appoint Persians to high offices, and encourage officers to adopt Persian customs. The wedding at Susa felt like the final step in their king's transformation into a foreign ruler. Some whispered that Alexander had been captured by Asia, not militarily, but culturally. Officers struggled too. Many had married Persian noblewomen they barely knew, and though the dowries were lavish, the emotional cost weighed heavily. Some feared their existing wives in Macedon would be cast aside or replaced. Others resented being used as political tools. They loved Alexander, but they did not share his dream of fusion. They had conquered Persia. They did not wish to become Persians. The resentment reached a boiling point during the mutiny of Opis in 324 BCE, just months after the weddings, when Alexander announced he would send elderly Macedonian veterans home and replace them with Persian soldiers. The troops erupted in fury. They accused him of abandoning them in favor of foreigners. They shouted that he was no longer their king, but the king of the Persians. For Alexander, who believed sincerely in his mission, the mutiny felt like a personal betrayal. He responded with fierce emotion, first with rage, then with reconciliation. He publicly wept, embraced his soldiers, and invited Macedonians and Persians alike into a symbolic union called the Brotherhood of Man. It was a beautiful moment, but also a fragile one. The truth was simple. Alexander wanted unity more than his empire wanted to be united. The weddings of Susa had not healed old wounds, they had widened them, revealing an empire stretched between its king's vision and its people's resistance, and the biggest test was still to come. In the months following the wedding of Susa, Alexander pushed harder than ever to solidify his dream of a unified empire.
He imagined children born from the Susa marriages growing into a new ruling class, one that owed its identity not to Macedon or Persia, but to him alone. He believed he had laid the foundation for a hybrid society, a world where cultural lines blurred and loyalty transcended geography. But fate had a cruel habit of turning Alexander's grand plans into tragedy. The first unraveling came quietly. Many of the Macedonian officers treated their new wives with indifference or open resentment. Some simply ignored them. Others viewed the marriages as temporary obligations and continued living as if they were bachelors. Persian noble families who had hoped for genuine alliances began noticing the cold treatment. Instead of unity, bitterness festered. Alexander's attempt at social engineering was cracking long before the empire itself did. But the true collapse came far more dramatically through Alexander's own death in Babylon in 323 BCE, barely a year after the Susa ceremony. His passing at only 32 years old left the empire leaderless, confused, and trembling at the edges. The vision he had declared eternal now depended on men who had never truly believed in it. One of the first acts of Alexander's successors was to dismantle the Susa marriages altogether. The Macedonian generals, suddenly free from Alexander's idealistic oversight, divorced their Persian wives almost immediately. Some did it quietly, others did it with open disdain. All 80 unions dissolved like mist at sunrise. The message was unmistakable. Alexander's dream of fusion had died with him. The Persian brides, many of them noble women from the highest families, were cast aside. Some returned to their families humiliated. Others were left stranded in a political landscape that no longer had use for them. Statira and Parasartes, Alexander's own Persian wives, suffered even worse fates. In the vicious scramble for power that followed his death, both were murdered, likely on the orders of Roxana, Alexander's Bactrian first wife, who sought to secure her position and that of her unborn child. It was a brutal, bloody bookend to a ceremony that had once glittered with promises of harmony. Within a year, the mass wedding that had symbolized unity became one of the clearest examples of how fragile Alexander's empire truly was. His officers wanted power, not integration. His generals wanted sovereignty, not fusion. His dream of a blended world shattered as quickly as the marriages he arranged. Susa, once the stage of golden celebration, now stood as a monument to a vision the ancient world was simply not ready to embrace. The wedding of Susa, at first glance, may seem like a glittering footnote in the sweeping saga of Alexander the Great, a lavish spectacle of gold, silk, and incense. But its significance runs deeper than the ceremony itself. It represented the pinnacle of Alexander's most ambitious and idealistic political experiment, a vision of cultural fusion that reached far beyond anything the ancient world had ever attempted. Yet it also became the clearest proof that even a king who conquered continents could not reshape human identity by decree. In the centuries that followed, historians looked back at Susa with mixed interpretations. Some saw it as evidence of Alexander's genius, a bold attempt to replace conquest with cooperation, to build an empire not through force, but through family. Others saw it as the moment his policies became untethered from reality. Macedonian soldiers, who once adored him as a warrior,
The Susa marriages were annulled, The Persian brides discarded, and the symbolic union between East and West collapsed. Yet, paradoxically, Alexander's cultural fusion persisted in subtler ways. Greek language and ideas spread across Asia, mingling with local traditions. Cities he founded, especially Alexandria, became vibrant centers of multicultural exchange. The fusion he wanted didn't happen through marriage contracts, but through decades of contact, commerce, and migration. The wedding of Susa stands today as a powerful metaphor for Alexander himself. Dazzling, dramatic, daring, and ultimately doomed. It showcased the brilliance of his imagination, but also the limits of his power. He could conquer kingdoms, topple dynasties, and reshape maps, but he could not bend human loyalty or identity as easily as he bent the world to his sword. In the end, Susa remains a reminder that even the boldest dreams require more than spectacle. They require a world willing to change. And in 324 BCE, that world simply wasn't ready. At 7 years old, a Spartan boy experienced a moment that would redefine his entire existence. He was taken from his mother's arms and delivered into the Agoge, the state-run institution that would shape, harden, and ultimately claim him. This was not a gentle transition into adolescence. This was a severing. One day he belonged to a family, the next he belonged to Sparta. The boy's cries, his mother's grief, even his father's silent pride meant nothing against the will of the state. Sparta allowed no softness, no attachments, no childhood in the modern sense. The boy was now a tool being forged. His new home was a communal barracks filled with boys his age, strangers who would become brothers, not through affection, but through shared suffering. There were no beds, only piles of reeds the boys had to gather and tear with their bare hands. They slept on these rough mats, often shivering through cold nights with nothing but a thin cloak. Discomfort wasn't a flaw of the system, it was intentional. Every detail was crafted to teach endurance. A Spartan boy learned immediately that warmth, comfort, and parental affection were luxuries he could no longer expect. The food was scarce by design. The boys were given portions so small that hunger gnawed at them constantly. This wasn't negligence, it was strategy. The Agoge wanted boys who were cunning enough to steal, fast enough to escape punishment, and disciplined enough to survive on little. Theft was not condemned, incompetence was. If you were caught, the beating you received wasn't for stealing, it was for getting caught. The emotional environment was equally harsh. Instructors known as paidonamoi ruled with uncompromising brutality. They did not comfort, encourage, or praise. Their mission was to mold boys who could endure pain without flinching, humiliation without anger, and hardship without complaint. Crying was mocked. Smiling through agony was revered. A boy's worth was measured by his silence. Yet within this crucible, something else formed: brotherhood. The boys leaned on each other because they had no one else. Shared misery forged loyalty stronger than blood. This was the psychological heart of the Agoge. Boys learned to love Sparta because they had been cut off from everything else. But beneath this structured cruelty lay the quiet preparation for something far darker. The taking of the child was only the beginning. The real tests, the secret rites whispered about in the barracks, were waiting for them in the shadows. Once a boy survived the initial shock of separation, the Agoge moved into its next phase, reshaping him, bone and soul, into a weapon. Childhood, as we understand it, simply did not exist here. Every day revolved around physical trials, emotional suppression, and psychological conditioning that blurred the line between education and ritualized brutality. The boys trained barefoot year-round, even in the freezing Spartan winters. Their feet hardened into calloused pads, capable of sprinting over rocks, thorns, and burning hot earth.
They ran long distances, wrestled until they bled, sparred with wooden weapons heavy enough to break fingers, and endured drills designed to exhaust them to the point of collapse. When a boy fell, he was expected to rise immediately or be shamed by his instructors and peers. In Sparta, pain was not a reason to stop, it was proof you were doing something worthwhile. Hunger remained a constant companion. Meals were intentionally insufficient, a thin broth, a small piece of bread, and whatever else a boy could steal. This forced deprivation wasn't accidental. It trained boys to survive on minimal resources, to be inventive, and to rely on stealth. A successful thief was praised. A thief who got caught was beaten mercilessly, not because he stole, but because he failed. Failure was the only sin Sparta recognized. Layered atop physical hardship was psychological assault. Older boys were placed above younger ones in a strict hierarchy designed to fracture ego and instill obedience. Humiliation was common. Public scoldings, forced tasks, and tests meant to expose weakness. These acts weren't cruelty for its own sake. They trained boys to submit to authority, endure mockery, and swallow pride. A Spartan warrior needed to obey instantly and act without hesitation.
The Agoge carved away everything else. Communication was limited. Boys were trained to speak sparingly, briefly, and sharply. A wandering tongue was seen as a wandering mind. From this discipline emerged the famous laconic style, those short-cutting Spartan phrases that became legendary. Silence was considered strength, and the boys learned to wrap their emotions in it. Yet even in this relentless environment, bonds formed. Hardship created brotherhood. They became each other's allies, protectors, and rivals. They learned to read one another's movements, anticipate reactions, and operate as a collective unit. This cohesion would later make them terrifying on the battlefield. Still, everything they endured was only preparation. The Agoge was not finished with them. The secret rites, the real tests of stealth, survival, and killing, were waiting in the next shadows. If there was one paradox at the heart of Spartan training, it was this. The boys were ordered never to steal, yet punished only if they were caught. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was a lesson in stealth, cunning, and survival. The Agoge sought warriors who could move like shadows, take what they needed without detection, and operate behind enemy lines with ruthless efficiency. So the boys learned to steal food, clothing, reeds for bedding, even tools from instructors, anything to sharpen their instincts and test their nerve. Hunger fueled their motivation. The rations they received were intentionally inadequate, designed to force them into theft. A Spartan boy who wasn't hungry was considered dangerously unambitious. And so, under the cover of darkness, or during moments when the instructors' backs were turned, the boys schemed. They stalked kitchens, storage rooms, and neighboring farms, practicing silence with every step. A well-executed theft was celebrated among the boys. A failure often led to a public beating that could last minutes or hours. But the lessons went deeper than stealing. These exercises taught them to read the environment, where shadows pulled, how sounds echoed off stone walls, how to track a guard's rhythm, how to climb silently, how to disappear quickly. Every theft became a simulation of wartime infiltration. If a boy could snatch a piece of cheese without waking a sleeping instructor, he could one day slip behind enemy lines. Punishment, too, had a purpose. A captured thief was not simply beaten, he was humiliated. The instructors wanted the boys to feel the sting of failure so deeply that they would sharpen their skills to avoid ever feeling it again. Pain was merely part of the education. Shame was the real motivator. Some boys pushed the boundaries further, stealing livestock or slipping into helot quarters for supplies. These were dangerous missions. The helots, the enslaved population, had little love for Spartan youths, and if a boy miscalculated, the consequences could be fatal. But success brought prestige within the group. A fearsome reputation began not on the battlefield, but in the silent corridors of Susa,
the darkened fields, and the kitchens where boys learned to make their footsteps vanish. In these years, the Agoge shifted from harsh discipline to calculated danger. The boys were not just learning to survive hunger, they were learning to become hunters, silent, precise, and fearless. And soon, the stakes would rise even higher. Stealing food was one thing. Learning to kill without sound was something entirely different. The Agoge's most feared training stage was not the beatings, the hunger, or the endless drills. It was isolation. At a certain age, Spartan youths were separated from their peers and thrust into periods of enforced solitude, designed to strip them of dependence and reveal their true character. This was not meditation or quiet reflection. It was psychological pressure bordering on torment, meant to harden them into lone operatives capable of surviving without support. A boy placed in isolation received no guidance, no schedule, no companions. He had to find his own food, shelter, and warmth, relying entirely on the skills he had developed through stealth and theft. Nights became tests of endurance. Cold, hunger, and fear pressed in from all sides. Wolves and wild dogs roamed the outskirts of Sparta, and the Helot population, deeply resentful of Spartan dominance, could turn hostile if they encountered a lone youth. Isolation wasn't staged in a safe, controlled environment. It was survival in unpredictable terrain. This trial forced the boy to rely on instinct over instruction. Every rustle became a threat, every shadow a potential ambush. A Spartan youth learned not only how to move silently, but how to listen, really listen to the world around him. The wind carried warnings, footsteps revealed intent. Even the silence of the night taught him something. Remain unnoticed or die. But isolation wasn't only about physical survival. It was a test of the mind. Boys who panicked revealed they were still children. Boys who grew reckless showed they lacked discipline. The ones who emerged stronger understood self-reliance at a level few societies demanded of adults, let alone adolescents. These youths returned to their peers transformed, quieter, colder, more aware of their environment, and hardened in ways words could barely explain. The secrecy around isolation trials was deliberate. Spartan elders refused to document details and did not encourage boys to speak of them afterward. Each youth's experience was unique, personal, and haunting. They believed a warrior who had faced the world alone would never fear an enemy army. And yet, isolation was only the threshold to something darker. Stealth could keep you alive, silence could keep you hidden, but to truly serve Spartans' interests, a boy had to learn a skill far more chilling. He had to learn to kill, not on the battlefield, but in the shadows. If the earlier Agoge taught boys to endure pain and isolation, the next phase taught them something far more chilling: how to kill without hesitation, without noise, and without remorse. Spartan warfare was not limited to the phalanx. Behind the shield wall stood another tradition, one whispered about more than openly discussed. The boys were trained to operate alone, to stalk enemies, and to eliminate threats silently. For Sparta, killing was not merely a battlefield skill, it was a civic duty. The instructors never stated outright, "Today you will learn to kill." Instead, the lessons were embedded in every exercise. The boys practiced creeping footsteps, learning how to distribute their weight so that even dry twigs wouldn't snap beneath them. They learned where to strike the human body for silence: the throat, the kidneys, the lungs. They were taught the anatomy of vulnerability, instructed not through diagrams, but demonstrations, sometimes on animals, sometimes on condemned helots.
To modern sensibilities, it is horrifying. To Sparta, it was refinement. The boys trained with short daggers, Xephos sharpened to a lethal point. Unlike the long spear of the hoplite, this blade was meant for ambush, for slipping between ribs, for ending a life before the victim could cry out. Instructors drilled them endlessly on speed, one motion to cover the mouth, another to drive the blade home. These drills were repeated until muscle memory took over. But the physical technique was only half the battle. The real test was psychological.
The Agoge sought to create young men who could kill without flinching, without moral conflict. Where other Greek cities debated ethics and philosophy, Sparta stripped such questions away. Duty replaced contemplation. Obedience replaced doubt. The boys were conditioned to believe that hesitation endangered not only themselves, but the entire state. Night training intensified this transformation. Boys were sent into darkness to track instructors posing as enemy scouts. Failure meant a beating. Success meant praise, but delivered so sparingly that it felt like winning a drop of water in a desert. Over time, the boys came to view the kill not as a crime, but as a measure of competence. Some whispered that the greatest honor was to perform a silent kill during the Krypteia, the secret service of Sparta. But that brutal rite lay further down the path. For now, the boys were learning the most dangerous lesson of all. A Spartan warrior must not only be strong, he must be unseen, lethal, and absolutely loyal to the city's will. And soon, the Agoge would test whether they could use these skills not in drills, but in life-or-death trials conducted under real shadows. Spartan boys were not raised to depend on supply lines, supportive communities, or the comforts of camp life. To Sparta, a true warrior needed to survive anywhere, under any conditions, without begging for help or waiting for rescue. So the Agoge forced its youths into the wilderness alone or in small groups with nothing but a knife, a cloak, and whatever wits they possessed. Survival wasn't framed as an exercise, it was a necessity. The mountains surrounding Sparta were harsh, rocky, and filled with dangers. Winters could be bitter, summers scorching, and wild animals prowled in forests and ravines. A boy had to learn not just how to exist in these conditions, but how to thrive. If he starved, froze, or was attacked, that was simply nature's judgment. Sparta did not mourn the weak. Tracking was the first skill taught. Boys learned how to read prints in mud, distinguish fresh from stale trails, and follow prey silently. They were required to catch animals without using large weapons or traps that made noise. Observing the land became second nature. The flight of birds revealed human movement. The direction of wind determined escape routes. The shape of clouds foretold rainstorms. Shelter construction was another test. Spartan boys built low, hidden structures out of branches, stones, and earth. Structures designed not for comfort, but for concealment. Smoke from a fire could give away their position, so they learned to stay warm through insulation and body heat. Eating raw food was not uncommon. Water had to be found, not collected. They identified underground springs, dew-rich grasses, and riverbeds that hid shallow pools. Dehydration killed the careless. The Agoge ensured boys never made the same mistake twice. Foraging required botanical knowledge. The wilderness surrounding Sparta offered edible roots, berries, and herbs alongside poisonous lookalikes. An incorrect choice meant vomiting, fever, or death. This was intentional. A Spartan who could not distinguish healing plants from lethal ones was useless to the phalanx. But the most important lesson was psychological. Isolation in wilderness revealed a boy's inner nature: fear, panic, arrogance, or discipline. A Spartan youth had to silence his own mind before he could master his environment. This training forged warriors who could operate deep behind enemy lines, whose bodies resisted exhaustion, and whose minds remained sharp even in hunger or danger. The Spartan trained in survival was not just a soldier, he was a living weapon, self-sufficient and deadly. Yet even these grueling trials pale in comparison to the most secretive and feared rite of all, the Krypteia, the moment when Sparta tested not only skill, but loyalty to the state's darkest mandate. Among all the trials of Spartan youth, none carried more secrecy and more terror than the Krypteia. This was the whispered rite, the shadowy initiation that transformed selected boys into instruments of state violence. Not every youth entered it. Only the strongest, most cunning, and most unquestioningly obedient were chosen. To be selected was considered an honor. To outsiders and to history, it remains one of the most unsettling institutions ever created. The Krypteia began without ceremony. A boy was summoned quietly, sometimes in the dead of night. He was given only a dagger and a cloak, and then he vanished from normal Spartan life. Those who saw him leave did not speak of it. Those who did not see would not ask. For months, even years, the initiate became a ghost, unseen, untraceable, accountable only to the Spartan elders. The primary purpose of the Krypteia was surveillance and domination of the Helot population, the enslaved class that vastly outnumbered the Spartans. The Helots worked the land, fed the army, and sustained the city. But Sparta lived in constant fear of revolt. So the Krypteia functioned as a brutal reminder that rebellion meant death. The young members stalked the countryside at night, hiding by day, monitoring Helot villages and eliminating anyone deemed a potential threat. There was no oversight, no rules of engagement. A boy might slit a throat under the cover of darkness or strike down a target on an isolated road. These killings were not random, but strategic, designed to terrorize, to suppress, to maintain Spartan control through fear. And the boys were expected to do it silently, efficiently, without hesitation. But the Krypteia was more than a mechanism of oppression. It was a psychological crucible. Isolated from comrades, forbidden from forming emotional ties, and forced to kill alone, the initiate underwent a transformation. He learned to live invisibly, to navigate terrain with near-animal awareness, to think independently, and to confront the most intimate form of violence, killing, not in battle, but in cold blood.
The elders believed this made a warrior unbreakable. A Spartan who had killed alone in darkness, without the roar of battle or the protection of comrades, would never fear any enemy again. The Krypteia taught absolute obedience and absolute ruthlessness. But such training carved deep scars. Some boys emerged hardened, others hollowed. A few never returned at all. And for those who survived, the trials were far from over. The Krypteia would push them to confront something even more dangerous than the Helots themselves. If the Krypteia tested a Spartan youth's capacity for violence, the next trials tested something even more fundamental: his ability to conquer fear itself. Spartan elders believed that a warrior who feared darkness, uncertainty, or death was a liability. So they created a set of secret rites focused entirely on stripping fear from the mind. Rituals that blurred the line between psychological conditioning and spiritual ordeal. The most infamous of these was the rite of night and silence. During this phase, the initiate was required to spend long stretches alone in the wilderness, sometimes for several days, sometimes longer, without food, fire, or even the reassurance of movement nearby. He could not speak. He could not sing. He could not hum or chant to steady himself. Silence was absolute, imposed not by rules, but by the crushing weight of isolation. In this darkness, the boy was forced to confront every thought and terror that surfaced. He was instructed to stay hidden during daylight, for helots or wild animals might kill a lone youth on sight. By night, he was expected to move, observe, and train. He practiced walking in complete darkness, relying only on touch and sound. He memorized the terrain so deeply that he could navigate by instinct alone. The goal was to dissolve the natural human fear of what cannot be seen or heard. But the rite went further. The boy had to confront staged terrors orchestrated by the elders.
Distant screams, sudden rustling near his camp, the crack of a branch, or the unmistakable shadow of another figure watching him. The elders never attacked directly, they simply reminded him that danger was always present. The key was to remain silent, still and unbroken. Many boys returned from these rites trembling, exhausted, and hollow-eyed, but alive. Those who failed to master fear were removed from the cryptire. Those who mastered it returned transformed, moving with a predator's quiet confidence, no longer startled by darkness, no longer shaken by sudden noises. They understood that fear was not something to eliminate, but something to dominate. In the phalanx, this training would make them immovable. As scouts, it made them ghosts. As enforcers of Spartan control, it made them terrifying. But there remained one final trial, the culmination of everything the Agoge and the cryptaya demanded, a task that required stealth, survival, loyalty, and the absolute suppression of fear. The final test was a hunt, and this time the prey could fight back. The last trial of a Spartan youth was never written in laws, never formally acknowledged, and rarely spoken of even among Spartans themselves. It existed in the shadows, known only through hints, fragments, and the uneasy silence of those who passed it. This trial was the culmination of everything the Agoge and the cryptaya sought to create. A soldier who belonged wholly to the state, who could kill without trembling, and who had severed the final ties between himself and the softness of ordinary human life. The final test was a hunt. Unlike earlier tasks, this hunt had no instructors lurking nearby, no staged obstacles, and no symbolic targets. A youth was given only a cloak, a dagger, and a vague directive: eliminate a designated threat to Sparta. Most often, the target was a helot suspected of rebellion, someone strong, capable, and dangerous. This was not an execution of the weak, it was a contest between predator and prey. The boy had to track his quarry across fields, forests, and ravines, relying on skills honed through years of deprivation and training. He had to observe habits, anticipate routes, and choose the perfect moment to strike. A sloppy kill meant death. Silence was essential. A single scream or misstep could alert other helots and turn the hunter into the hunted. This was the moment that separated boys from warriors and warriors from ghosts. If the youth succeeded, he returned to Sparta without celebration. No ceremony greeted him, no public honor was bestowed. Instead, he was met with nods from the elders, small, grim acknowledgments that he had crossed the final threshold. He had taken a life not in the chaos of battle, but in cold, solitary precision. Sparta believed this forged unbreakable mental discipline. A man who had killed in silence would never lose his composure in war. But if he failed, if he hesitated, fled, or was detected, his fate was sealed. Some were killed by the helots they stalked. Others were quietly removed from Spartan society, erased from memory. Sparta had no use for half-made warriors. For those who survived, the final test marked the end of childhood and the beginning of service. They returned to the barracks as full Spartiate men, inducted into a collective identity that demanded absolute loyalty. Their lives were now instruments of policy, war, and state survival. No family, no fear, no self. Only Sparta. The secret rites of Spartan youth were never meant to create human beings. They were meant to create weapons. Weapons that did not question, hesitate, or break. And in that mission, the Agoge succeeded with chilling perfection.